recording standpoint? Oh, perfect. Perfect. Okay, cool. Okay, I call on the Prime Minister to begin the debate.
Okay, great. I'm assuming you can hear me from the introductions. Just briefly before I start, I'd like to thank Rumen for the competition. Great debater, obviously, and fantastic guy. Been a lot of fun. Okay, get started soon. When an eagle flies into the cave of a dragon, all that happens is it gets burnt, it burns to its money, its bones get broken, and it bleeds away its international legitimacy. Two arguments from open government. The first is that the US cannot keep control over the Asian region in the long run. They will just lose out to China. The second is they create a necessary resource trade-off with securing their other IR incentives elsewhere. On the inability to keep control of Asia, the essential intuition here is that China have enormous incentives to keep all of their neighbors under their sphere of influence. Here are three specific things. The first is for security. You're able to prevent things like wars, coups, other sorts of things which could occur on your border, which could lead into spillover violence in your Western region, which could lead to destabilizing effects on your own population. This can lead to things like migrant crises, or people flee across the border into your Western region and cause you a lot of problems. The second reason is you need to protect your consumer base and trade links outside of your country, which is to say the Belt and Road Initiative runs through many different countries. If any one of them gets substantially harmed, then you're basically screwed. I mean, that's what happens if you dig up part of a train line, right? The train can't run, right? So that's why you need that belt, that road, that rail. Additionally, if you're able to keep that consumer base well, then they're able to continue buying your cheap products you flood their markets with. The third thing to say is historical ties, which is to say that there is international relations built up over literally centuries between the Chinese government and their regional neighbors, which means that not only is there an incentive to keep them well, but there's also an additional capacity when compared to the US, because there's institutional knowledge and historical cooperation between governments. But we also think that other countries likely buy into China's sphere of influence. The reason for this is because of, firstly, the first mover advantage that China had with dealing with these countries prior to the US's entrance. A second is their large, enormous economy, which they're able to leverage specifically for goods which are needed in those sorts of countries. It is much easier for them to just ship their goods along their pre-existing Belt and Road trade lines than to have the US fly things from the other side of the world. With this said, how do China outcompete the US here? There are three ways. The first is they establish stronger trade links, because it is easier to build a road if you're next to a country than if you're not beside that country. It is just trivially easier for them to build this up. The second reason is that they posture militarily, like how they've done on India's border to try to make sure that they keep the BJP in check, and they ensure against things like conflict in Jammu and Kashmir, preventing that from spilling over. We notice that they also, in times, step over the line. We see this in the Filipino islands and the status quo, which they are arguing over with the Filipino government, and which they're willing to have severe intervention in order to take if necessary. The third thing to say is political control, which is that China props up governments in the region which are beneficial to their own interests. Why does this hurt the US? Notice, when the US goes into the region, and they say that they are going to establish these sorts of political links, these sorts of economic links. I've already given you compelling reasons why they can't compete, but they must continue to defend these regions. They must continue to trade with them. They must continue to fight a losing battle. Why? They create an expectation that they will do so when they sign agreements with these countries, when they pledge to the world that they're going to support them through thick and thin. No, thank you. As a result, then, we think because of this sunk cost that the US has continued to fight a battle in this region, which they are massively losing. This is comparative because China are never going to enter the European or Middle Eastern markets. There's just non-cooperation with them historically. There is a history of the US having closer links with them. They fought together in like major wars in the past. You had like international agreements whereby you like vetoed against China, or like you voted against like Russia and things like this, which has meant that you've been bonded together. There's also, you speak a common language. There's a massive amount of intergovernmental cooperation between you. Second argument then, on all the shitty stuff which happened as a result of this move. The first thing to say, and I'm just going to point out like a bunch of trivial impacts which happened, which is, or not trivial impacts, enormous impacts, which is that there was a rise of ISIS in the Middle East, which occurred during this period. Like they got substantially stronger. Additionally, there was a decreased backing of Ukraine, which led to the annexation of Crimea in 2014, which led to the invasion of the mainland in 2022. Additionally, there was things like the Afghanistan pullout, which occurred as a result of an increase in built-up arms by the Taliban Iran in that region. We think that the US is able to just like prevent these things to a substantially great degree, or are able to fight back against them. There are two broad mechanisms for this. The first is just boots on the ground. The US has a big fucking army. They have a shit ton of money, and they're able to massively contest in wars. They don't lose land wars, the US, and they also have one of the most sophisticated international security apparatuses in the world, which means that they are quite competitive in this sphere. Notice that even they don't even need to like be constantly engaging in fighting in these wars. Just the fact that they have more bases in this region, the fact that they are showing more of a willingness to prevent these sorts of things from happening, creates an inherent deterring effect on groups like Russia invading in 2014, like the attacks by ISIS and other terrorist organizations. We think that the withdrawal was enough for these things to occur, because you're able to bolster recruitment on an individuated level if there's a morale boost of the US like pulling out, and also there's this time sensitivity, which is to say once they leave, it is you know that you have a window of opportunity to attack, and you can seize this. This is like literally look at like gut check this. Like Afghanistan fell in like a week, right, when the point of the US started pulling out. Before I move on to why this hurts the US so much, closing.
What is the comparative in this debate?
The comparative is that they. Oh yeah, that's a fair question. The comparative is that they continue to invest their money and their time and their resources and the security apparatus in like Europe and the Middle East. This was like massively implicit in all the arguments I already made, but whatever. Why is this important? The US cannot stop engaging in these regions like the Middle East and like Europe, regardless of the fact that they've pulled out somewhat. The reason why is because they have allies there they must defend through international and mutual agreements. They lose their resources, like tech in Israel, like food in Europe, like tax fraud in Ireland, like oil in the Middle East. As a result, then, they must continue to defend these regions. We say that given this framing of how important these regions are to the US geopolitically, they're going to defend them anyways. What we did on our side of the house, in the absence of Obama making this mistake, is we're able to prevent the situation getting so bad that when you had to intervene, you had to give significant resources. This is very important to the US because of their global image, because they took away taxpayer money, which could have gone to people, because they had to risk more lives in the process, and because it harms their international legitimacy and standing going forward. For all of these reasons, remarkably proud to propose. Thank you.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Call on the Leader of the Opposition.
Hi, am I audible? Great. POIs in the chat. We'll take one probably from OO. So have a POI ready, guys. Hope you give us one too. But don't unmute yourself. And Andy, it was very fun doing this comp with you too. Thanks for the shout out. Let's be very clear on what changes and what doesn't change in this debate. We can't claim that the United States will abandon Israel and Western Europe. This is simply insane. They can't claim that the United States will abandon Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. This is equally insane. Where the debate actually activates is where it is the fringes. Ukraine, Middle Eastern countries versus Southeast countries like Thailand, like the Philippines, and these particular things. I'll give you reasons for why this is the case. If they are right, and Taiwan is so crucial to the United States, the semiconductor industry basically holds, 1/3 of the United States economy. They have been main allies for long periods of time together. They have inbuilt cultural and economic ties with Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. They will protect them on both sides of the house. This does not change within the debate. Secondly, China will not invade Taiwan no matter how many times debaters will say that this will happen. There are very strong reasons as to why this won't happen. Firstly, this is the most highly defended island on the planet. There are landmines in this particular case. There are very advanced United States weapons that have existed there for a long period of time. The Americans are not stupid. They know how crucial this island it is to them. It is also defended by Korea and by Japan because they have one particularly big enemy there, which is the Chinese, that they all share between each other. Thirdly, war is super costly for Xi Jinping to do in this particular case. Now, we're talking about all-out war, right? Where you send the troops, where you try to take the island. Imagine this happening. Like, even if you're the CCP, you doing this will be complete suicide. You can still threaten. You can still talk about it. You can still do your media exercise, but you will never do it. Now that that's out of the way, What is the thing that we have to prove to you? The comparative is most likely some form of peace between China. Obviously, friction between the United States and China will always happen, but relative peace is likely to happen on our side of the house. The first most basic reason is that America is not posing a direct attack on the sovereignty of China. Because what are the Americans doing with the pivot? They put out their factories in the States. Then they put out their military bases to protect their factories. What do the Chinese people think? That America is encroaching on their thing. That because how do you say it? Look at geography. This is literally the backyard of China. If you want to launch missiles from this thing, if you want to do an invasion, it doesn't matter if the United States does this. The perception that this might happen, the risk that this might happen from the Chinese perspective is reason enough for you to counter them. Is reason enough for you to send your companies there to try to get these allies to you in this particular case. Alternatively, the United States and China have a very good mutual existence relationship. E.g., the Chinese understand that they need to sell their goods too. The United States is a huge consumer base for China. Both consumers in terms of individuals who buy their plastic goods, buy the low-tier textile goods that they're operating, and their businesses that buy the goods and services that are produced in China. These inverse relationships exist between both of them. So the likely comparative is that you will not have escalation, but rather some kind of neutrality form between the two countries. But let's say this doesn't happen. This is complete bullshit. We don't care. We will never beat China in this region. They say, but you can't beat out the Chinese because why? What reason? They actually didn't give a reason. They just rebutted our reason. Here's why you'll lose out to China in the long term. Firstly, China is the second largest economy in the world. It is a very strong competitor towards the United States in many of these cases. But notice, it's a dictatorship. It can pull resources in the short term because it's not democratically elected and can invest it in long-term projects, such as building a highway to influence these countries, such as investing an army and going to challenge the Philippine Islands in this particular case. They can take this hit because this is so important to them. This is the equivalent of the South America and to the United States as a base of comparison. Look what happened with the Cuban Missile Crisis in this particular case. But secondly, we don't care about this territory. There is no asymmetrical benefit that comes to us other than the chips, and I've already explained to you why it is out of it. Cheap labor you can get from South America and Africa. Natural resources you can get from South America and Africa. I know this doesn't destroy this point, but it mitigates it to enough extent to show you that this is not an important thing. Why is this comparative to our impacts? Because we tell you, United States cares about Europe and the Middle East. Why? Because they're very strong allies in this place. Now, what do we know for a fact happened? ISIS went up in our particular war. Russia invaded Ukraine. What does this mean? This means that the United States can't just leave these people on their own, right? You have to go to them. So what ended up happening is the United States still got pivoted to these places. They still had to go and intervene. The problem is now the fire was too big enough for them to deal with, right? Because now an all-out war was happening in Ukraine and in the Middle East. This meant that they had to give a lot of money, a lot of taxpayer money, a lot of dead soldiers' lives in many of these cases in order to deal with these fires. This is likely to be comparatively different on either side, as in either a war would never break out if you have sufficient US soldiers in these places to deter and kill these people, or the war might still break out, but it's much different if you have positions and you have much easier ability to put your troops there, to put your resources there, and to counter both of these forces, meaning that the net sum of money and influence that you're losing out is less in this particular case. Before I move on, opening opposition, do you have a POI?
All of your analysis explaining why the United States can't deter China from invasion presumably also applies to Russia. The distinction is that China poses a bigger threat to the United States specifically.
No, I'll elaborate this thing. I don't understand. Okay, here's the thing. If we're going to hang this debate on the very light probability, very small probability, that World War III would break out, give it to them. This is what I'll say. I won't elaborate anymore. Let's look at what is the real thing. So their point is basically, but Rumen, the inverse relationship might also happen. You putting soldiers will also escalate Russia and Iran. My first response is these are completely meme countries compared to China. Just compare their GDP. Russia has a lower GDP than fucking Italy. Iran has even lower GDP. There is a huge difference between the capacity and the military power of China, the second economy of the world, and the capacity and military power of some random terrorist organization in this particular case. But let's say you don't buy this. The second reason you should think of this is that simply numerically, they have much to lose. E.g., Russia has, for example, a declining population and not so big population. They don't have so much soldiers. Look how hard it is for these people to get someone to fight for them in many of these particular cases. They don't have so many revenue streams because they're dependent on natural resources. You can sanction the fuck out of their economy to lower them. And all of this is contingent, by the way, on them trying to do this particular case. We say if you put in so basically, this is their final response they give to you guys. But it will get bad on both sides of the house. Why? We tell you three things change. Firstly, your capacity to deter these people, simply them not taking the action, by having soldiers there, by changing their cost-benefit calculus, by these soldiers being able to kill them, not shooting a bullet, just being there, changes their incentive system so you don't get the big enough fire that you have to resolve now. Secondly, they can kill terrorists, they can kill the Russians, they can actively fight in many of these cases if they have to. But thirdly, soft power. You can negotiate with these people. You can come down to the table and maybe give them some kind of offer, some kind of economic thing that presumably you lose if you have to do this particular things. At the end of the day, it's very simple. You'll never beat the Chinese for this area, and you have for a fact a fire that's continuing to burn and continuing to take the taxpayers' money. For all these reasons, easy OG.
I'm basically going to try from closing government to run opening government's case, but do it properly. Two arguments from closing government. Firstly, I'm going to prove that it is a far better use of the United States resources and diplomatic efforts to try and court the countries in Eastern Europe and in the Middle East. And it is far, far more likely for them to actually be able to get to change the behavior of those states versus trying to change the behavior of states in Asia. And secondly, I'm going to prove why you prevent or at least make far less bad catastrophe scenarios that opening government want to talk about. So firstly, where is the US able to actually effectively influence countries more in order to kind of get them over onto their side? The first premise I want to suggest is that in Asia, the political loyalties of most countries are basically set in stone anyway, and is virtually impossible for the US to sway countries either way. So there is a set of countries that will basically always be pro-US. So Taiwan has literal security concerns, which means that it needs to be in, needs to collaborate with the US. It doesn't have a choice. Countries like Japan and South Korea, number one, have bad histories with China, as Tene points out. But secondly, their kind of history, like their state building process, was basically led by the US. So post, like the various wars in the 20th century, the US was basically the key architect of the modern states of Japan and South Korea, which is why the people of those countries will almost always basically prefer dealing and like voting in candidates that are pro-US versus ones that are pro-China. So Dion is right. The US did have the first mover advantage in those countries, and it's essentially just a waste of time and a waste of money for the US to actually try and sway those countries either way, because they don't really have a choice. The other set of countries are countries that will never be pro-US and will have to rely on China. Those are countries like Cambodia and Laos. Opening opposition says, well, they were incredibly Chinese aligned before Obama, and now they're pro-US. No, Cambodia and Laos are still vetoing any measures in ASEAN that, for example, ask China to cede control over the South China Sea and stuff like that, right? Like Cambodia and Laos are still empirically very, very pro-China. Why is that the case? Two reasons. Number one, they are literally like authoritarian communist countries that the US does not want to deal with, which is why they have to be aligned with China. But secondly, because of their history with the US, like the US just bombed the hell out of them in the various wars in the 20th century. So obviously the people of those countries very rightfully fucking hate the idea of collaborating with the US and would rather turn to China, who they see as a far, far more reliable ally. And so essentially, it is also a waste of time and resources to try and court those countries insofar as they will never be they will always be aligned with China in ASEAN meetings. They will never back the US if a conflict breaks out and things like that. The comparative is, in the Middle East and Eastern Europe especially, the countries are far, far more politically ambivalent. For example, Eastern Europe, most of the countries in Eastern Europe following the collapse of the Soviet Empire are legitimately ambivalent, whether they want to support the US or Russia. Lots of people, ex-Soviet states, for example, have lots of genuine nostalgia for Russia. And Ukraine, before the war broke out, a lot of the most popular political candidates were actively advocating for more cooperation with Russia. There were other candidates that were actively advocated for cooperation with the US. That's because these countries arose out of histories of contestation, where genuinely they do have deep historical and ideological links with both the US and with Russia. The national identities of those countries are far, far more ambivalent in terms of which great power they want to align with. And so the US is actually able to meaningfully get a change in terms of those countries and how they behave. Not just like Ukraine, but basically, the other countries of Eastern Europe as well. And And also, countries like Saudi Arabia try and play off the great powers across each other as well. They are far more ambivalent in how they're politically aligned, which means that the US doing things like trying to influence countries in terms of security, in terms of investment, in voting in regional blocs, far better use of their time to focus on other places other than Asia. Opening government, to be fair, have some like in little mechanisms about why countries will sway one way or the other, half of which are totally uncomparative, but whatever. We tell you why categorically it is almost impossible for the US to win over some countries, and for why for a bunch of others it does not need to bother because they are already in the US's side. And it means, oh, by the way, also that opening opposition is very little comparative. I don't know what they're going to try and achieve, insofar as there's very little delta to be gained. Second argument then, why we actually prevent catastrophe scenarios. So Prime Minister rattles off a list of bad things that might not have happened, and it says the US could prevent them on the comparative. And the one mechanism is more boots on the ground. Believe that if you want, but I think the extent of that is totally unclear. Like 2,000, 3,000 more soldiers in a certain area. I don't know if that's the tipping point for whether or not Russia decided to invade Ukraine or not, especially given that Russia knows that if they do invade, the US is going to send troops anyway, right? As per OG's own analysis, that they have to defend these places. And so I don't know if that actually meaningfully changes the way in which Putin makes his mind. I think the real difference is the diversification of energy. What does that look like? It looks like, for example, the US preemptively putting significant funding into LNG processing plants in Eastern Europe, more trade routes to Eastern Europe, right? Owo is correct. The US is now a net exporter of energy, but it needs the critical infrastructure in the first place to be able to do anything with that. You actually need processing plants that turn that LNG into gas in order for that to have any effect. It looks like the US facilitating more trade between European and Middle Eastern countries, like, for example, funding oil and gas pipelines and mediating contracts between those countries in order to try and diversify energy away from actors like Russia and Iran. Before I go into the implications of that, opening opposition.
The United States was already viewed as a violent force in the Middle East due to recent interventions in the 90s and 2000s. Asian countries didn't have such recent and polarizing interactions. Build the processing plants there.
Yeah, number one, obviously a lot of Asian, as I like the analysis in my first argument proves why the stuff on Asia is incorrect. But also in terms of the Middle East, look, you're not going to sway like Iraq probably, but there are a whole series of other countries like Qatar, countries like the UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia that genuinely are a bit more politically ambivalent because like maybe conflicts happen in a couple of places, but they didn't happen everywhere. Anyway. The implications of this argument is essentially twofold. Number one, bad actors feel far more empowered on the comparative to do bad things. This doesn't just look like invasion, by the way, but I think it's an important thing, right? Like Russia presumably is far less likely to have invaded Ukraine if they knew that the EU wouldn't be so tied up about how to respond to it because they are so dependent on Russian energy. They would have felt far less empowered to do all those things if they knew that countries wouldn't have been so internally divided about how to respond. But also just like other bad things, right? Like Saudi, like Iran being able to do some worse things because they know that like you can't really respond too much because they control so much of the energy industry. But I think this is a good thing in and of itself. It means you get far less fluctuations in energy markets. When crisis does happen, like Russia, Ukraine, or Israel, people around the world feel far less of that. And a lot of those people are in the US. It just means that US citizens are also far better off. You are able to get more security in the region. For all those reasons, very proud to go.
I thank the member of Gov. Now call on the member of All.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Let me just get my timer up. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Go. I think so far in this debate it's been extremely fuzzy, and it's been really fuzzy because nobody's really talked about what the US interest actually is and why doing this sort of policy is going to actually, and doing this pivot to Asia is actually beneficial for the US interest rather than some sort of like weird like sort of geopolitical game that the average US citizen probably doesn't care about. So I think what people in this debate care about, and what people in this debate actually want as Americans, is that they want a good economy and they want to be able to access things like cheap goods. They want to be able to grow their GDP. They want to be able to secure their own livelihoods. I think this is far more important than some sort of theoretical sort of like theoretical sort of security concern, right? I think that things like mutually assured destruction is symmetric in this debate. I think that both countries have things like nuclear weapons. I think that exists, and I think that both countries have a huge incentive not to like go to war against each other simply because like the fact that thousands of people die, the fact that there's loads of economic like sort of harms that occur on both sides. I think that we're going to explain why those risks are actually lower on our side through our reasoning. But I think the most important thing in this debate is access to cheap goods. It is access for the American people to have secure, high quality goods and produce, to be able to have that cheaply, when it's the difference between being able to afford certain amount of food, having enough money to be able to afford afford clothes, enough money to have enough cheap inputs to grow your American businesses and have GDP growth. I think that's far more important for America. And I think it's far more important interest to America, the point at which most Americans care about what's happening proximate to them, and most politicians care about what's happening proximate to them, as opposed to something happening thousands of miles away. I think it's far more intuitive. So what is the case coming from us? I think that OO largely neglects this long-term economic benefit to the US, and we're going to explain why the US gets this. And I'm going to explain specifically why the US is going to pivot to China and get better relations in China, as opposed to Southeast Asia. And I think it's really important. First, I think it's just simply empirical. I think a lot of people in this debate aren't very aware of what politics was like in 2012. The reason why Obama empirically did this was because there were inflamed relations with China. There was a growing trade war caused by the Bush administration, which is why Obama did the pivot to Asia and specifically pivoting towards China. But let's say you don't buy empirics. I think several reasons. Firstly, I think this is the biggest economy within Asia and the biggest economy by far. That is that in 2012, the Chinese economy was 5 times bigger than any other Asian economy there, which means that the US, when it's concentrating its geopolitical interest and concentrating its pivoting, it's going to concentrate on the biggest country. It's just logical. But I think what it is that the US was at a time where it was growing its things like its tech industry, it was growing its consumer base, which means it was having a growing things growing middle class. We're bouncing back from the 2008 financial crisis and all of these things. What this means is that oftentimes the US needs a huge amount of cheap resources in order to power itself. China is an export economy, which means it wants to supply all of these things to them. And notice that the US doesn't have synergy with places like the European Union, which tend to compete on similar grounds. That is, the European Union is also trying to grow its tech and its insurance industry and all of these things. Notice that it can compete with China and get those cheap goods in the first place. So that's partly why it also pivots, because it has a growing middle class and needs cheap labor, cheap goods, and all of these things. Notice they say, oh, you can go elsewhere, but I think there's unique advantages with China. I think firstly, they have a very strong government in the form of the CCP. And this sort of government control means that it's more secure business doing that. Notice when you do it in Brazil, there's a huge amount of corruption that occurs. There's a huge amount of instability where entire cities are in the control of drug cartels. It's not something that's very easy to do business there, as opposed to having a very stable government like the CCP. But secondly, I think that a lot of these other countries have poor scalability. They don't have a highly educated technical class. Notice that during China has developed a huge amount of sort of technical expertise, which allow it to do things like set up large factories. But also China is just large. It has the capacity to supply a very large economy like the US. Very few countries have that capability to supply that many goods in that short period of time. I think all of these, and I think finally that the US just has a first mover advantage, which means that China wants the US currency because the US has a currency advantage, which was more acute in 2008, which means that you can buy more goods for what the US gives China. All of these things, I think, means that ultimately, the US is able to get unique things from China, is able to meet its unique demands and at the point in 2012 in order to grow its economy. But even more importantly, I think what this does is it protects against prevents things like protectionism and prevents things like trade wars that go into the future. And I think several reasons. Firstly, because you're starting this in 2012 when the Chinese economy was smaller, now the Chinese economy is nearly the same size as the US. So it's becoming a threat. But notice that when you do this from the very beginning, US and China now become interdependent with each other. That means that the US has paid loads of money and has built up Chinese manufacturing capacity. Now China has this huge manufacturing capacity. The only place that has a large enough consumer and business class to absorb all of that capacity is the US. So they become hugely economically dependent on each other, when this wouldn't have occurred if the US was pivoting away to Brazil and all of these other worse countries on their side of the house. What this means is that they become reliant on each other economically, which means that the US is able to influence China on the foreign policy. It can do things like sanctions, and China can do the same to the US, which means that both of them have incentives to compromise, which is why you prevent war in the first place, which is how we reduce that terminal risk on our side of the house. But even more important, right? Let's say that the US goes to the Middle East, it goes to the US. Now when China grows, the US is now increasingly pitted against them. When they don't have such high interdependency with each other, this increases the probability of having a trade war with each other, because now China is increasingly increasingly seen as a threat. And since they're not reliant on each other, the US is more likely to put things like tariffs and protectionist policies and sanction Chinese allies, which all inflame relations. Before I continue, POI from opening.
International companies based in the US have traded with China before and after this. Apple's biggest plants are in China. Obama didn't put them there.
Yeah, but the point is that this massively increases that. Like, you can pinpoint some examples like Apple, whatever, but there's a huge amount of increase when the US literally puts agrees and signs billions and billions of dollars of trade agreements with that. There has to be a delta in this debate, and it's just empirically what happened. Notice then finally that China becomes less of a long-term competitor with the US. Why? Because notice when the US is asking and demanding things from Chinese people and Chinese factories, they're demanding a certain type of good. They're demanding things like textiles, they're demanding things like raw, like materials, all of these things, which means that China and the US aren't competing with each other in the same industries. The US is doing things like tech and whatever, while China is supplying the raw materials to power its economic growth. Notice then that China becomes less of a direct competitor. On their side, China is far more likely, when they don't build that relation with the US, to become a direct competitor, to do the same things that the US is doing, because now they're going to have to rely on Southeast Asian countries to try and fuel their growth. What this means is that oftentimes they have to rely, they can't do things like cheap manufacturing because the cost of labor is much cheaper in things like Southeast Asia. They have to do things like tech and all of these things. All of these things mean that you get increased competition. We get more trade wars. We get more protectionist policies, which ultimately harm the American consumer. It harms GDP growth, which is the most important thing in this debate. For all those reasons, very, very proud to oppose.
Thank the MO. Call on the GovWit.
Hello. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. 30 seconds and I'll go. Okay. POIs in the chat, please. Our path to victory in closing government is simple. We break the deadlock that exists on the comparative in this debate by firmly establishing where the US can make some change and where it cannot. What Aidan does, in extension, is twofold. Firstly, he proves to you why countries in Eastern Europe and the Middle East are ambivalent and Southeast Asian countries are static. Therefore, what this means is that even if a position is completely correct on the incentives of the US, they fail to prove why it is that you're able to influence policy or the state of affairs in those environments. Secondly, Aidan conclusively wins on the energy clash, which is the positive material and impact we bring to you. I now briefly want to weigh on why this wins a round in itself. Firstly, the presence or absence of US troops is unlikely to be determining in whether conflict happens, as teams correctly point out in top half. Rather, what the motion really is about isn't merely about where you put your eggs, but rather how you use the limited political leeway and capital you have as the US administration. This looks like which policies you prioritize, which international actors you collaborate with more, and who you marry yourself to in terms of international diplomacy. What are our analytic contributions then on the energy clash, and what is the genuine delta in this debate in terms of Russia? Firstly, as Aidan explains to you, you put more power plants and infrastructure in place to be able to deal with the shock. What this looks like is both creating facilities where you can do things like store liquid natural gas. It looks like creating more pipelines, creating more routes for LNG and for coal and for shale to travel from the States to Europe. The reason this is exclusive is twofold. A, the private sector doesn't have an inherent incentive to create this infrastructure. That is, it tends to be very expensive and companies don't collaborate because it's a collective action problem. Secondly, though, often when it comes to things like nuclear power or like the more sensitive or like new forms of technology, these are things which can be very difficult for the private sector to solve without government authorization. That is, these are sensitive techs, and unless the administration itself reaches agreements, you're unlikely to be able to do these things anyway. The second reason we give you here for why you're able to protect the energy supply is because you're able to act as a mediator between the Middle Eastern countries and Europe. What I would flag is that there is a lot more inherent animosity between countries like Saudi Arabia and other US allies with Europe, insofar as these are the people who you perceive as your former colonizers, especially countries like the United Kingdom. Therefore, I think the US is far more able to basically create bridges there and do things like ensure constant oil supply or consistent prices, rather than having European investors having to worry about whether you're going to stop getting this oil in the first place. Therefore, you get more stable and cheaper energy routes, both from the states themselves, but also from the Middle East. What is the third claim here? It's that you collaborate on a shared and exclusive policy of protection. When you're also working with the Asian countries and you're also setting up these routes and these relationships, what it means is that when your US or when your European partners, when Germany asks you, when shit hits the wall, what are you going to do? Are you going to support us? Are you going to be able to provide us with the resources and the energy? That is when you don't have a safe answer for them. You say, maybe, we're going to do our best. On our side, when you realize and you prioritize this threat, this sends a strong signal that you will be there for Europe when shit hits the fan. This means two things. One, Europe no longer feels abandoned. You no longer get the wave of like US skepticism that was the reason that countries like Russia felt comfortable invading Ukraine. You're more able to essentially support and maintain cohesion. Secondly, though, you don't get things like the Nord Stream pipeline. The reason Germany decided they had to primarily import gas from Russia itself is exactly because they didn't know they would be able to rely on the States or on US allied actors anymore, especially following the election of Trump. Uniquely then, we explain to you how you're able to get far more sustainability and stability as far as the energy supply goes. Not that the impacts here are massive compared to the impacting of like a relatively unlikely wall. That is, one, the knock-on of energy prices massively affects your economy, cost of living, many individuals across the entirety of the world. 300 million Americans are affected by this policy, as opposed to the unclear harms that comes from an invasion. Therefore, I think we certainly win on the severity and the harshness of the impact on people within the US itself. Let's then do the placement of the case and explain how this beats each of the other teams. First, in closing opposition, they largely capitalize on this idea that you're more able to trade with China and potentially prevent China from trying to be aggressive toward you. I have two groups of responses here. Firstly, more generally, the reason this argument tends to be symmetric is that the vast majority of trade between countries like US and China or the US and Japan happens through private sector investment. That is, I'm not sure what it is that the US government has to do to allow these things, especially when things like, shipping over the Pacific tends to be very safe. That is, the only way in which this could be a problem is if the US took a very harsh anti-China stance, which only happens on their side of the house. There's no reason the US would be imposing these tariffs otherwise. Secondly, I want to deal with the Chinese economic harms idea, which comes out of both closing opposition and opening opposition. The way I'm going to deal with this is I'm going to prove to you why China has strong reasons not to stop trading with the US or with the US's allies. This would make the harms from opposition bench moot. Firstly, you require a consumer base as an export-based economy and an economy who tries to establish economic dominance per opening opposition's own analysis. Secondly, though, the Chinese economy is also interdependent on the United States economy, especially for advanced parts or things like production expertise. What this therefore means that you cannot afford to try to embargo the US. It's very unlikely that you do this. And even if it isn't, the energy supply is a prerequisite for the US to be able to do manufacturing. That is, we outweigh this given we're logically prior. Before I deal with opening opposition, I'll take a quick POI from them.
To the small extent that the United States is reliant on OPEC, it still maintained under the Obama administration a close relationship with Saudi Arabia that allowed it to have some leverage over OPEC. Why does it have to be friends with all of the Middle East and all of Europe to achieve your benefit?
Two things here crucially. One, having a close relationship with OPEC doesn't mean you can steer OPEC to be friendly towards Europe as well. This leads to after effects. Secondly, you need European support for the reasons I have established, given that your economy is dependent on exports from European factories as well. And if it's the case that the energy problem balloons as it does, it's going to affect you far more harshly. Let's respond to opening opposition. Firstly, on whether China invades and why military bases actually are not effective. I think there are three reasons here. here. Firstly, it's just impossible to encircle an island. Therefore, this means it's going to be a protracted siege that you cannot get over quickly. What knocks this out, though, is the reason that China is never going to do this. And this preempts any capacity claim, because I'm going to prove to you why there's no incentive. Firstly, massive loss of life is politically unbearable. Much of what the CCP has been up to is trying to differentiate itself from the days of Mao and trying to project some degree of internal stability and some degree of the rule of law. At the point at which many thousands of Chinese men are dying on the shores of Taiwan or Japan, that is when Xi is going to lose local support. So you can get the exact same benefits merely by avoiding conflict in the first place and just threatening. Look, compared to our opening, our case provides the proper comparative, and we categorically prove where things change. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to propose.
Thank the Gov Whip. Now call on the Op Whip.
The big issue with each one of the other three teams in the debate is an unclear definition of what the eagle wants. What is the United States' interest? Why, to the average American, is war or foreign relations like the Senkaku Islands or Iraq the most important issue? Because war is unlikely to break out anyways in Asia. And why does the average American care about this more than the prices that they pay at the till? Why on earth is it energy more than the average cost of a good or service that they pay for? And why on earth would America not continue to hold their most precious energy investments in those countries that they talk about, even when they are making this pivot? That's never explained. The most important impact and the most important interest in this debate is improving the economic opportunity of the average American. And we explained that the strongest link to doing this is US-Chinese relations, because as they tell you, the dragon was rising. It is a far larger economy than Southeast Asia and any of the economies in Europe. And as the opening government tells you, China and the United States are not just synergistic economically, but they are the largest threat to you. This is why you need to cool relations and get on their side. Empirically, this is what occurred. Obama's pivot to Asia focused on cooling relations with China and stabilizing their relationship. This is why America was put on a path of growth that consistently increased China's dependence on the United States. This is really important because what it led to was a massive reduction in the prices of goods and services for the average American, more job opportunities, more innovation that the average American is actually able to experience. So why is this the most important impact in the debate? There's three reasons why. First of all, it is the trade link that is the largest out of any of these groups. The fraction of Southeast Asian countries that opening opposition talks about maybe courting, and their semiconductors is a fraction of what China would be able to provide you, particularly on their pathway to ascension and rise. But secondly, it is a much stronger link into stopping the kind of bad actions that we want China to stop, for the reason that when China is more dependent on America, we have better ability to control them by pulling out our trade and forcing them to make concessions that they would not be otherwise able to do if they were not so dependent on us. But thirdly, it explains why there's a much more feasible pathway to peace on the security issues that we want, for the same reason that I've given above. This is much more strong than opening opposition, who talks about some more semiconductor trade. Very unclear how that helps the average American. More manufacturing, cheap manufacturing, aligning with a manufacturing superpower is how the average American is benefit. That is why the pivot to Asia was a good policy. What do we hear in response to this extension, which is the most important impact in the debate? We get two things. The first thing closing government says is, well, actually, this was mainly private sector investment, so your case doesn't work. First of all, I don't know why that is true. And that also mitigates their side, right? Like if this was only about private sector investment, why is energy not also private sector investment, right? This just narrows the debate. It does not actually clear the margin. But secondly, we explained why the counterfactual would be a rising trend of protectionism, which would have accelerated much, much faster, which they neglect, which means that there was going to be way less competition, way higher prices for the average consumer than there otherwise would have been. Then they say, well, there was going to be dependence on China anyways because they were export-based. What? First of all, that is the pivot to Asia policy. That is what we were supporting. Before this, American-Chinese relations were much worse off, and there was an antagonistic relationship between them. What Obama tried to do was cool those relations and turn a page, stabilizing relations between China and the United States. Empirically, that is why China is now much more dependent on the USA than they were before. They have to accept a margin in this debate. This is the winning impact in the debate because it is the biggest impact to people in America, and it is the most important United States interest. So now let's address how the other teams try to win the debate. The main clash that occurs is basically trade and competition. Can China or the United States win in Southeast Asia or these other countries? The first thing that I want to explain is that this just matters much less than our impact. There is no explanation of why these are the key countries we want to trade with. Every person buys a manufactured good. We get trade with the dragon, and as opening government says, that's the biggest person we want to align with. But I'll much more powerfully flip this than opening opposition does, because opening government basically says China has lots of money, they're a dictatorship, so they can essentially effectively beat America out in any competition with these Southeast Asian states. Two things. First of all, we explain why that's actually much less true in a world where China is dependent on us, right? We can curtail their activity and prevent them from doing unfair expansion that we don't want them to do to be ahead. But secondly, actually, the United States would have been able to establish a first mover advantage in these countries more than China would. Why? Because during this period, China's economy was much smaller than the United States was. Theirs was 8 trillion, we were 16 trillion. And that's why the United States would have been able to go into those countries and offer much better deals to those countries before China was able to come in. Maybe they had some historical links, but these are capitalist economies with political leaders who need to support their people by putting food on the table. If they see a much better deal from the United States, they are likely to take it. This is why America would have won the war and actually established a first mover advantage. Thirdly, they don't explain why the United States cannot do this, right? Like why, here's the problem, right? Why does there need to be a zero-sum game? Why can both countries just benefit from trade with these countries? But finally, I point out when closing government says that these countries will just never trade with America because of political incentives, two things. First of all, they don't explain why these Middle Eastern countries and Eastern European countries who were also under the influence of communism before do not have the symmetric problems. But secondly, and more importantly, yeah, maybe they were historically communistic or whatever, but ultimately they overlook that when they get money from countries. When the United States is coming in, courting them with a big deal, these are politicians who want to get reelected in democratic states, and therefore they have an incentive to agree. But ultimately, look, even if they win this clash on there being some more energy linkages between these countries, it just does not matter for the reason that the United States would have likely kept their energy investments, even absent a pivot to Asia, because they would have likely prioritized their most important investments in the Middle East and in these other areas. So if they were so essential for the kind of energy that they were talking about, we get that on our side as well, so they don't have an exclusive impact in the debate. Finally, then, on issues of military and security and why this is not important. The first thing I want to say is that this is not a relevant impact in the debate because a war in Asia is simply unlikely to occur. There's lots of reasons for this. Countries have trade links. Countries don't want to fight each other. Wars are expensive. Wars kill people. Why is this likely? Why does the average American care? So this is just a much less important impact in the debate. But much more powerfully, no team is actually able to explain a delta on this. For instance, on opening government, when they say this was going to lead to the rise of ISIS and the problem of ISIS, but why would have an American presence in the region got rid of the problem of ISIS? They never explain why American interventionism is good. Why is this the core American interest? If it is, why wouldn't America continue to finance those war efforts in these places? Why was this a result of the pivot to Asia as a result of other symmetric reasons, right? Like they just don't explain why any of this had to do with the pivot to Asia, so they are off clash in this comparative. So what does the average American benefit from the most? It is the cheap iPhone charger that they buy. It is the cheap goods that they are able to access. It is the jobs and innovation that happens because America is in a better relation with China and there's less trade wars between them. It's the most important impact in the debate. I'm proud to oppose.
I'd like to thank the op whip. I'd like to thank everyone for an excellent grand final.